Hello everyone, this is Chelsea with my last presentation on the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. So I'm going to be talking about just a basic information about the sanctuary, people and conservation biology, biodiversity, habitat loss, climate change, fire and biodiversity, habitat fragmentation, ecosystem services, overharvest, invasive species, preventing extinctions, endangered species management, conservation planning, conservation in human-modified landscapes, and lastly, my management recommendations. So this is the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. It expands throughout the Florida Keys and provides protections for seagrass beds and corals, and many rare and endangered species. People play different roles in a multifaceted approach to conservation. This interdisciplinary work is important in conservation in order to ensure that the many interacting factors of an issue are considered when planning for conservation. It is important to know the many biological factors at play, like hydrology or biology, and it's also just as important to know social factors, like economics and culture, that affect the issue. These factors influence each other, and failure to address a factor in planning could lead to a negative outcome when putting a conservation plan to action. People are also able to integrate policy into conservation. Policy implements measures that people can be held accountable to in order to promote conservation of an area. Policy is a useful tool in conservation as it can be used to create sanctuaries or wildlife refuges, prevent pollution or destruction of ecosystems, as well as many other things. The Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary was administered by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration through the U.S. Department of Commerce. The sanctuary was created and exists under federal law. Both the National Marine Sanctuaries Act and the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary and Protection Act designate the sanctuary and push for its conservation. And so this sanctuary is a really great example about how policy can lead to conservation. Biodiversity is high in the Florida Keys due to its location. The Florida Keys are very close to the Tropic of Cancer, and within the tropics, biodiversity is very high due to its relatively stable climate throughout the year and high availability of sunlight. There are 3 different types of diversity, including genetic, organismal, and ecological diversity. Genetic diversity within the Florida Keys is higher than in other areas of the world with similar ecosystems that are unprotected, but genetic diversity is still decreasing within the Florida Keys. This decrease in genetic diversity is due to smaller population sizes and the extirpation of species. Within the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, there is a project underway called the Genetic Rescue Project, which aims to increase genetic biodiversity by gathering information that can increase knowledge about coral death and possible mitigation strategies. The organismal diversity within the sanctuary is high because of the large amount of species that are within the ecosystem in this area. The ecological diversity of the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary is not very high because the sanctuary is almost entirely made up of a single type of ecosystem. Habitat loss is what occurs when a habitat is changed into a form that cannot support the organisms that originally inhabited that area. Humans can cause habitat loss with landscape modification and by inducing climate change that can affect a habitat and by polluting habitats. Habitat loss within the Florida Keys is caused by changes in ocean temperature, ocean acidification, pollutants, and daily human disturbance. Many of these factors combine and result in serious habitat damage that affects the entire ecosystem. The Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary is within the Coral Barrier Reef biome. Worldwide, this biome is endangered because of damage to coral by ocean acidity, water temperature, and physical destruction. The biodiversity of the Coral Barrier Reef within the sanctuary is higher compared to other parts of the Coral Barrier Reef biome because of the protections that have been placed on it. We can see the effects of habitat loss in coral reefs. Both climate change and fire can cause habitat loss due to ocean acidification. The effects of climate change that The effects that climate change has on the ocean include ocean acidification and changes in water temperature, as I mentioned before. And I'm going to be talking about ocean acidification a little bit more later, but onto changes in temperature. Climate change can affect temperature of water, which could affect the Florida Keys ecosystem. Climate change does this by causing ice to melt, which changes the salinity of water, which ultimately has an effect on ocean currents and where warm and cool water is being distributed. The Florida Current is a current that carries warm water from the Caribbean into the Florida Keys. Climate change can cause the direction of this current, causing the water in the Florida Keys to become cooler. And as these water temperatures get cooler, organisms are no longer in their ideal habitat, which causes them to move to an area that is more favorable. Fire also affects habitat loss. Fire affects geophysical processes in the environment because it causes the release of heat, gases, and nutrients in the atmosphere that were previously being held in biomass that was burned. Vegetation holds onto a lot of carbon, and when this vegetation is burned, that carbon is released. After a fire, vegetation can grow back and recapture this carbon, but if the amount of vegetation growth isn't enough to recapture all of the carbon that was released, then the amount of carbon in the atmosphere will increase. Fire and climate change can contribute to ocean acidification. Ocean acidification occurs when carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is dissolved in the ocean, and this creates carbonic acid, which ultimately causes water to get more acidic. And this has effects on life within the ocean. Coral reefs are made up of polyps, and on those polyps are algae. The algae provide the polyps with food and are part of what makes coral the color that they are. And the combined effects of warmer or even colder water temperatures and water that's higher in acidity that's caused by climate change, as well as pollutants that enter the water, can cause algae to unattach from the polyps. Because the algae are no longer on the coral loses its color because it has lost its food source. This process is known as coral bleaching. So this graph shows coral bleaching events within the Florida Keys and how that affected the absolute percent coral cover. The effects of this change in habitat trickle down throughout the ecosystem because coral reefs provide food and habitat for many other organisms that live in the water, which is why coral bleaching is such an important conservation issue. According to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, it's estimated that about 25% of known marine species are supported by coral reefs, which makes ocean acidification have such large impacts on so many different species. There are a few patterns that are seen in habitat fragmentation. Fragments that are larger tend to contain a higher variety of species than fragments that are smaller, as well as more rare species. They also have more rare species than smaller fragments. Fragments that are closer to other fragments tend to have a larger population sizes of species. The coral barrier reef system within the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary can be seen as a fragment of global coral barrier reefs. This coral system is a large fragment and contains a wide variety of species, and it is very biodiverse. Large fragments also tend to have rare species. Within the reef, threatened and endangered species are more common because of the protection of their habitat and resources. Within this fragment, threatened and endangered species like sea turtles, manatees, egrets, queen conch, and Bahama sea stars are more prevalent. And this map shows all the different areas where there are stony coral reef fragments, and each dot would represent that. And you can see over here in the Florida Keys that there's a group of those, so that is the fragment. Ecosystem services are processes and resources that affect a healthy ecosystem supplies and that humans benefit from without having to pay for them. The sanctuary is a tourist destination where people come to see many plants and animals and to recreate. The fish in the sanctuary provide food for people, and mangrove forests that line the coastline of the sanctuary protect from storms and reduce erosion. Valuation of ecosystem services is the action of associating an economic value to an ecosystem service in order to demonstrate the importance of ecosystem services. Valuation of ecosystem services is also used to make sure that ecosystem services are not being taken for granted and to help people understand the value that an intact ecosystem has. Although no formal valuations have been done, it has been recognized that the value that the sanctuary plays in providing habitat and resources that are used by fish that are later caught by fishing companies, as well as the value of tourism and how the sanctuary supports this and the economy. Humans have a history of overexploiting prey populations dating back to prehistoric times. Humans have caused many extinctions when they spread to parts of the world that had not been inhabited by humans before. Consumptive users are instrumental for conservation because these users raise the value of wildlife, which fuels conservation. They raise the value of wildlife by assigning a social or cultural value to them. When people give a value to these species, this gives people a reason to support conservation, because they want to continue to be able to use these species. In the waters surrounding Florida, fishing is a large industry which plays an important part in Florida's economy. In southern Florida, commercial fishing is the fourth largest industry. Hogfish are an important fish for the Florida marine ecosystem as well as the Florida economy, and they have been overfished. To address this, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission has lowered the bag limit of hogfish, set a recreational harvest season, and increased the minimum size limit with the hopes that these measures will help to rebuild the stock. By increasing the minimum size limit, this allows for the biomass of the fish population to increase and lessen the effects of fishing down. Because fishing is such a large part of the Florida economy, people have made conservation of fish stocks more of a priority in order to secure more economic security. This shows how consumptive users are important for conservation. People who depend on these fisheries economically are motivated to implement conservation so they can continue to profit and maintain their business. Invasive species are species that are introduced to a new area that is non-native to them. Invasive species can be extremely disruptive to ecosystems because they do not fit with the balance of the ecosystem that is native to the area. Many times, invasive species will dominate resource use, which causes native species to suffer. Lionfish were first observed around Florida in 1985 and since then have increased in spread. The cause of introduction of lionfish to the Florida Keys is unknown, but the spread of their distribution is largely attributed to them following ocean currents. Lionfish are very damaging to the ecosystem in the Florida Keys in many different ways. They eat native fish as well as compete with native fish for resources. Lionfish also do not have natural predators within the Florida Keys, which allows their population to flourish. This causes large ecological consequences because lionfish are causing the depletion of species of fish that play important roles in the ecosystem. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission is addressing the issue of lionfish by encouraging people to catch lionfish without any bag limits. Specifically, in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, lionfish removal permits are granted to people so they can catch lionfish in sanctuary preservation areas. These preservation areas are no fishing zones for every other fish, but allow for lionfish to be removed with hand nets or slurp guns. The goal of this management strategy is to remove as many lionfish as possible from the Florida Keys to protect the valuable and fragile ecosystem that exists within the Florida Keys. The sanctuary also encourages reporting of lionfish, and this is what the report page looks like on their website. They're collecting information on many things like location, temperature, depth of dive, and whether or not the lionfish was captured.